Saint of the Day. May 13th. Saint Julian of Norwich. Saint John the Silent Bishop. May 13 Memorial. Patron of cats, Saint Julian of Norwich, c. 1342 c. 1416, aged 73-74, anchorite, mystic, writer, ascetic, spiritual director, also known as Dame Julian or Mother Julian, born late 1342 and died after 1416, was the greatest of all the English anchorites of the Middle Ages. She wrote the earliest surviving book in the English language to be written by a woman, Revelations of Divine Love. It was popular in the 14th century for a number of English men and women to withdraw from the world as hermits. They were known as anchorites. Their hermitage was a small room attached to a local church. Each room had 2 windows. One through the church wall, permitting the anchorite to receive communion. Through the second window, the anchorite received food brought to him or her by village people. Thus they at all times had the window of their heart open to Christ and open to the world. As a young woman, Julian, who was born about 1342, became an anchorite at the Church of St. Edmund and St. Julian in Norwich. When she was 30, Julian suffered from a severe illness. Whilst apparently on her deathbed, Julian had a series of intense visions of Jesus Christ, which ended by the time she recovered from her illness on May 13, 1373. Julian wrote about her visions immediately after they had happened, although the text may not have been finished for some years, entitled Revelations of Divine Love. 20 to 30 years later, perhaps in the early 1390s, Julian began to write a theological exploration of the meaning of the visions, known as the Long Text. This work seems to have gone through many revisions before it was finished, perhaps in the first or even second decade of the 15th century. Until her death in about 1416, Julian stayed in her simple room. Like most anchorites, she prayed, fasted, did penance, studied, sewed clothing for the poor and advised the village people. In her book, she described her 16 visions of Jesus. As she wrote this book about God's great compassion for us, Julian developed a special vocabulary. She called the Creator our Mother and our Father. She called Jesus the Redeemer our brother. Revelations is a celebrated work in Catholicism because of the clarity and depth of Julian's visions of God. Julian of Norwich is now recognized as one of England's most important mystics. Julian of Norwich lived in a time of turmoil, but her theology was optimistic and spoke of God's love in terms of joy and compassion, as opposed to law and duty. For Julian, suffering was not a punishment that God inflicted, as was the common understanding. She believed that God loved everyone and wanted to save them all. Popular theology, magnified by catastrophic contemporary events such as the Black Death and a series of peasant revolts, asserted that God punished the wicked. Julian suggested a more merciful theology. She believed that behind the reality of hell is a greater mystery of God's love. In modern times, she has been classified as a proto-universalist, although she did not claim more than hope that all might be saved. At the time of Julian's death, people from all over Europe traveled to her room, or cell, to ask her advice. Everyone recognized that she was close to God. The Church never formally declared her a saint, but through the ages, people have called her blessed. If there is anywhere on earth a lover of God who is always kept safe, I know nothing of it, for it was not shown to me. But this was shown, that in falling and rising again we are always kept in that same precious love. Julian of Norwich. Reflection. We sometimes say that God is both very close to us, immanent, and yet also far beyond anything we can truly describe or experience, transcendent. When does God seem close to you? When does God seem mysterious and even confusing? Saint John the Silent. Saint John the Silent Bishop, 454, c. 558. John was born of a noble family at Nicopolis, in Armenia, in the year 454, but he derived from the virtue of his parents a much more illustrious nobility than that of their pedigree. After their death, he built at Nicopolis a church in honor of the Blessed Virgin, as also a monastery, in which, with 10 fervent companions, he shut himself up when only 18 years of age, with the view of making the salvation and most perfect sanctification of his soul his only and earnest pursuit. Not only to shun the danger of sin by the tongue, but also out of sincere humility and contempt of himself, and the love of interior recollection and prayer, he very seldom spoke, and when obliged to, it was always in a very few words, and with great discretion. To his extreme affliction, when he was only 28 years old, the Archbishop of Sebast obliged him to quit his retreat, and ordained him Bishop of Colonian in Armenia, in 482. In this dignity John preserved always the same spirit, and, as much as was compatible with the duties of his charge, continued his monastic austerities and exercises. Whilst he was watching one night in prayer, he saw before him a bright cross formed in the air, and heard a voice which said to him, "If thou desirest to be saved, follow this light." It seemed to move before him, and at length point out to the monastery of Saint Sabas. Being satisfied what the sacrifice was which God required at his hands, he found means to abdicate the episcopal charge, and retired to the neighbouring monastery of Saint Sabas, which at that time contained 150 fervent monks. Saint John was then 38 years old. After living there unknown for some years, fetching water, carrying stones, and doing other menial work, Saint Sabas, judging him worthy to be promoted to the priesthood, presented him to the Patriarch Elias. Saint John took the Patriarch aside, and, having obtained from him a promise of secrecy, said, "Father, I have been ordained bishop, but on account of the multitude of my sins have fled, and am come into this desert to wait the visit of the Lord." The Patriarch was startled, but God revealed to Saint Sabas the state of the affair, whereupon, calling for John, he complained to him of his unkindness in concealing the matter from him. Finding himself discovered, John wished to quit the monastery, nor could Saint Sabas prevail on him to stay, but on a promise never to divulge the secret. In the year 503, Saint John withdrew into a neighbouring wilderness, but in 510 went back to the monastery, and confined himself for 40 years to his cell. Saint John, by his example and counsels, conducted many fervent souls to God, and continued to emulate, as much as this mortal state will allow, the glorious employment of the heavenly spirits in an uninterrupted exercise of love and praise, till he passed to their blessed company, soon after the year 558, having lived 76 years in the desert, which had only been interrupted by the 9 years of his episcopal dignity.